the last panel in this morning is going to deal with the strategic and security consideration and how they might encourage authoritarianism in the region. And we have two presentations. The first is... are you going first? Yeah. First is Pierre Razou. He will begin with a presentation on geopolitics in North Africa. Pierre Razou is the research director for strategic studies at the Institute of Strategic Research in Paris, and is a student.
Can you please set up the...
Oh, we will have stress, that's why I asked.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your trust, Islam and Steven. I'm just going to go down directly into the topic. Contrary to the, let's say, the past decades, unfortunately, for the Europeans, the Mediterranean area and Northern Africa is no longer a bridge, but far more a barrier. Why? Because this is how, do you listen there? Okay. This is how, I would say, Northern Africa is viewed from Europe. I do not say it's good or bad, I just say that this is a fact. By the people. And by the policymakers. And by the journalists. And by the elites. So it means that, to be simplistic and view from Europe, what the people see is that you have now, let's say, 6 jihadist fronts in the wide area. A bit still in the Levant with ISIS, because definitely ISIS is not dead. I can tell you that I was on site, I was acting and I was involved in the fight against ISIS personally for the past years, and being there, they are still ISIS for quite a while. And they will change the shirt, the label will be different, the name will be different, but they will be there, be sure. The second one, of course, is in the Sinai. The third one is in the Yemen. The fourth one is, let's say, in what I have called the Libyan chaos, so in Libya. And you have a huge jihadist front in the Sahel-Sahara belt, which is threatening everyone in the country and in Northern Africa. What has changed, I would say, since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring? This is the fact that now the Northern African governments have understood that they are in the same boat as the European countries. Which means that for the European leaders and political elites, the key question is where drawing containment lines against jihadism, terrorism, and all the related traffics. And you have two options. And by the way, you have these options in every country and in every political party in the wide scope of European leadership. You have those who said, okay, we need to help the northern government, the Northern African governments, to tackle the issue because we are all in the same boat. So for that, we have to put the line of containment the more south possible. Why? Because we need to compartmentalize the different fronts. The key question is avoiding at all price that we will favorize a reunification of these fronts. If for any reasons 2 or 3 of these fronts are linking, we will be in a big mess. We in Europe, you in Northern Africa. And it's perhaps different, the views, the perception is different from this side of the Atlantic, but when you are on that side of the Atlantic, believe me, everyone feels concerned. The second option is, let's say, the populist option, saying, well, we don't care. Just wait that the dust settles and we will see. Which means that, well, let's go for the history, we will see. If the jihadists want to tell Libya, Egypt, well, we will see after. No, the problem is that you have a lot of people thinking that, saying, okay, we need to just contain these so-called threats from the center of the Mediterranean area, and we will see later. Currently in Europe, the big fight is between these two lines. In every country, including in mine, and I would say in Brussels, with a lot of political parties. This is what is at stake now there. So, logically, and this is the big problem, logically, all, and I turn to pure geopolitics, all these northern African countries, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, should cooperate, should act at the maximum, sharing a lot of economy, a lot of security field, a lot of exchanges. Why? To be able all together to tackle these topics and this threat. Because you can see that there are two targeted countries, Algeria and Egypt. If Egypt fails, you can easily imagine the merging of the front there. If Algeria collapses, it will be a big mess also in the area. This is what we think. And the problem is that at a moment when all these northern African countries should cooperate a maximum, well, the fact is that they don't. Why? Because North Africa is split in vertical strips of interest and influences. The Egyptians, let's say Egypt, they don't care not too much of what is going there or there. But they care a lot of their new gas field here, of the Red Sea, and of course of the Nile River, and of their connection with Ethiopia and with the African Union. Algeria, of course, is looking north-south, up to France, Spain, Italy, Brussels, and Belgium, and then to the south, the African Union too. Morocco is looking north-south, and no longer east, or no longer in the direction of the Med area or the Northern Africa. Of course, Morocco is looking for Spain, France, but most importantly to the US, to Canada, to Brazil, and to their new, so-called new border, which is the new African and West African countries. So it means that everyone is looking north-south instead of looking and cooperating east-west. And this is a huge geopolitical problem. Why? Because according to these views, the east-west borders are closed, and not only closed, but often with military frictions, and more than military frictions, including fights, small fights, tensions, except between Tunisia and Algeria. This is the only border which is currently open here. All the other borders are closed on the east-west. But paradoxically, all the north-south borders are totally permeable. Totally. Which means that if you want, for example, if you are a criminal organization or a terrorist or a jihadist organization, and just by the way, you want to bring, let's say, money or weapons from there, let's say, to there, you are not going to go by the Med area, which is far too complex, very, very well monitored. It's very complex, very unsecure. You are just going to put and to follow these lines, which is the old lines of all traffics. This is pure history. And it means that when you need, well, you go up north, there, and there, and there. And it's easier, because it's open borders, and you can do whatever you want. You just have to bribe a bit, to pay a bit, and everything goes at the final destination. So it means that with that in head, you have then the implication of the big players and the global powers. Of course, you have the United States of America, very, very active in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt, even if now in Egypt it's more difficult. But anyway, with 3 big strongholds in the area. But now you have the return of the Russians. And Russia plays really, really a real role in the Med area and in Northern Africa. In Egypt, of course, I can tell you a lot of anecdotes when I was in Egypt just a while ago, when you see huge panel with Marshal Sisi kissing Tsar Putin and saying, this is my great friend for a long period of time, etc. Of course, with Libya and with Haftar, with Algeria, the Russians are extremely still powerful and influential in Algeria. And then, of course, China. But if Russia used more the hard power, let's say the military cooperation and all this sort of stuff, China used the soft power and the money. And they are everywhere in Northern Africa. Once again, I could tell you a lot of anecdotes on the Chinese in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, in Algeria, and now in Morocco, which is quite new, let's say, from the last 2 years or 2 years and a half, when His Majesty went to China and made a lot of deals. So it means that now the Chinese consider that Northern Africa is directly one, not the, but one of the numerous roads leading from east to west. And they are going to really build on this stuff. And just to complicate a bit more the equation, you have now the local and regional players who invite themselves in this new playground. You have, of course, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iran, just playing in all these countries. Plus the big players, plus the foreign European players. So it means that you can just refocus and reprogram, that you can have a new program in your computer, which means that just forget the old time where Northern Africa was supposed to be in the sphere of influence of France, Italy, and a couple of other countries. Now Northern Africa is a playground for all the main players. I thank you, and I answer later.
Thank you for that interesting presentation. Now we have next presentation on terrorism in North Africa by David Gunstein-Ross. David is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Chief Executive Officer of Violence Global. Please.
Every good presentation begins with a presenter fumbling around to find where their PowerPoint is. Where is it, right here? Here, I'll leave it. Excellent. So first of all, I'd like to thank the editors of this volume. Dr. King, thank you for hosting this conference. It's great to be a part of it. I'm all that stands between you and lunch, so I'll try to at least make this brief and maybe entertaining. I wrote a very granular chapter, which looks at the rise of militancy across the 5 countries examined. Not rising in all 5, right? Morocco, for example, we have a foreign fighter problem, but not any sort of cognizable uptick in attacks. But anyway, it charts the path of militancy since the Arab Spring revolutions. So I want to step back from the granular and talk about 3 major trends that I see, and then go country to country and say, something interesting about the 5 countries. So I think there's 3 major takeaways that I have. The first relates to the lure of authoritarianism. When you're dealing with militant movements, there is a tendency to go for a strongman figure, as we can see with Hifter It's outside the scope of the 5 countries I examined, but you can clearly see that with Sisi. Or to go with laws that are, one could argue, too repressive. I think there's a very delicate balancing act when you're dealing with security, and a lot of it comes back to, if you go back several centuries to Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, right? The argument of Leviathan, one of the greatest books of political philosophy ever written, is that you have this struggle between anarchy, a war of all against all, and a Leviathan state that can protect people. And the argument Hobbes makes is that the Leviathan is preferable to anarchy. And in many ways, you can see that argument going on in the minds of people who are affected throughout the region. So violent non-state actors and militant movements fundamentally relate to the lure of authoritarianism. The second thing I would point out is that the militant movements in the region were very quick to exploit changes on the ground. It's not a coincidence, I mentioned at the outset, that we haven't seen a rise uniformly across all 5 countries in militancy and in terrorism. The countries where you have seen the most marked rise are Tunisia and Libya, the 2 countries that experienced a transition. That doesn't make the transitions bad, of course. It's simply to note that when political change happens, especially more wrenching political change, as we saw in Libya, where the instruments of the state, like the army, were completely eviscerated, militant movements, violent non-state actors tend to be very good at figuring out how they can exploit those changes. I would also note, as an analyst in the field, that if you go back to predictive analysis being made from 2011 through even end of 2012, a lot of it was the direct opposite of what ended up occurring. So 2011, you had somewhat of a consensus emerge amongst people in the security field, my field, and I dissented from this at the time. But there was this rough consensus that emerged that the revolutionary events were devastating to the movement that describes itself as the jihadist movement. Now, the exact opposite ended up happening. I think there are a number of reasons that this analytic, this flawed analysis occurred, but let me put 3 hypotheses on the table. One is the strength of pre-existing networks may have been underestimated. The second is that the ability of outside actors to influence events on the ground may have been underestimated. An example of this in Tunisia is the militant group Katibat Uqbayb al-Nafi, which was supported by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, very clearly. And a third may be that these actors, violent non-state actors in the region, are more strategic than people anticipate. The third theme that I would draw is the danger of having no authority in place, right? The paradox of the lure of authoritarianism. And we can see that clearly in Libya, where there was a very clear bleed over into Tunisia and also into Egypt and elsewhere as well. Mali is another example. But in Tunisia, when you look at the major attacks that have occurred, especially 2015 to 2016, you can't talk about those attacks without talking about Libya and events on the ground in Libya. Those are my 3, as I hit the microphone. It's okay to laugh. Those are my 3 themes. And now I want to turn and say a few things about the various countries. The first is Libya. One of the things that has occurred from about the 2014 through the 2017 period is you had a major struggle between 2 major militant organizations, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, or ISIS. Within that competition, you had embedded in the way these groups were competing for supremacy over their movement, an information operations campaign, which has been very understudied, in part because I think a lot of people bought into the information operations campaign. But the biggest, the best example of it, the clearest example of where this occurred is in Libya, with what you're seeing here. This is ISIS's takeover, not of Sirte, which they did capture, but of Derna, which ISIS never came to control. It's a very interesting story because the imagery is persuasive, but if you read below what's on the surface, you understand the problem with the imagery. So ISIS supporters tweeted about how, and pushed out over social media, they had captured this city. There was imagery of an ISIS convoy rolling in, heavily armed. They put an ISIS sign announcing the Wilayat, it says Wilayat Barca down here, announcing that they had taken over. And Derna was not a place any of us would want to set foot, right? You had a number of different militant militias that controlled different parts of the city. But it's a great example of, number one, very low social media penetration. And number two, imagery that contextually means something very different to Western observers than it means locally. So a convoy, an armed convoy driving into a city and not being opposed would mean something very clear here in Washington, D.C., or in Paris, or in Tunis. In Derna, with the collapse of the state and the military and police never reasserting the writ, it meant something very different. Likewise, this was a government building that just hadn't been used, right? The analogy I give for this is you're going into a McDonald's and putting your flag on Mayor McCheese's office, right? Mayor McCheese is not the real mayor of McDonald's. That doesn't mean you're now the new boss of McDonald's. Likewise, a government building in Libya doesn't, in Derna, does not mean as much. So to me, the interesting thing was how effective this information operation was. The Time magazine headline, but also thereafter, this got reported by basically every major outlet. CNN, Associated Press, and on, and by analysts as well. I remember talking to people at the time about how my assessment was that Derna was not captured. I even talked about this in Senate testimony in May of 2015, the month before it became obvious that it hadn't been captured. That was the month that ISIS's branch there, the Islamic Youth Shura Council, assassinated a man named Salim Derby, who was the head of the Derna Mujahideen Shura Council, and also another group. And ISIS's branch in Derna was kicked out of the city basically within a week, without their opponents bringing in any reinforcements, which is a strong sign that there was no capture. They were a force there, but hadn't captured it. So Libya, as I said, is very important to other countries. One country that's important to is Tunisia. Tunisia had a good example of an effort to grow a militant movement from scratch. It seemed to me, in looking at Ansar al-Sharia, that their strategy was one of dawah, hisba, jihad. Dawah being proselytism. This is a photo I took in Sousse prior to the crackdown in Tunisia back in March of 2013, with Ansar al-Sharia guys out there, with a dawah booth outside one of the major mosques in Sousse, while there are tourists 10, 15 feet away, not realizing who's right there. Similarly, they were very good at using social media early on in order to project the image of a constant array of activities. This was, they were an early adopter a little bit before social media became a common thing across the full range of militant organizations. But at the same time, there was this uptick in what one could call hisba violence, which is a difficult term to translate, but it relates to the concept of enjoining the right and forbidding the wrong. You can see a number of different attacks that were occurring at a fairly rapid pace from, in 2013. These were all minor violence, right? They're not, they weren't even assassinations. But it began with physical attacks on prostitutes. You had an uptick in attacks on different kinds of expression, like an art house cinema that was showing a movie about secularism, an attack on the head of a station, Nesma TV, when his station showed the movie Persepolis. It's about the Iranian Revolution. It's a cartoon, and there was one scene in there that some more religiously inclined Tunisians found to be blasphemous, attacks on Sufi shrines and the like. Now ultimately, to me, when you look at the strategy, it was an interesting one that ultimately we didn't see the end of because events overtook it. But it was a strategy of basically operating legally and openly while encouraging this kind of hisba violence to normalize violence, in my view, undertaking what they would regard as jihad violence, which is attacks on more military targets, usually in western Tunisia, like the Jebel Shambi mountains, and sometimes targeting politicians. Now ultimately this got overtaken because there was this very bloody week that occurred in July of 2013 when the second secularist politician of the year was assassinated, and the same week you had this major ambush in Jebel Shambi of the Tunisian military. Katibat Ubay ibn Nafi, which is a battalion of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, ended up killing 8 soldiers. 5 of them had their throats slit, which at the time was very reminiscent of the Algerian civil war. Like looking at it backwards from now, it's more reminiscent of ISIS and ISIS's methods. But that was actually at the time the deadliest day in Tunisian military history. So right after that, you got this escalation in terms of the state response. This was directly related to the events that caused Tunisia to implement a state of emergency, crack down on Ansar al-Sharia, and the like. Since then, one thing I would point to is the attempted ISIS takeover of the town of Ben Gurdain, which is in the southern part of Tunisia. They actually succeeded in overrunning the town for a number of hours. It seemed that they mapped it ahead of time, in that they were able to quickly target members of the security services, kill some of the key counterterrorism officials. Ultimately, this probably would have been a worse attack had it not been for Sabratha, Libya, which was where a lot of the attack planning for Tunisia was based out of, getting bombed back in February, shortly before the Ben Gurdain attack occurred. Finally, I'd point to the fragile nature of the Tunisian economy and its dependence on tourism, which is one reason why there were a number of prominent attacks on tourist targets back in 2015. We've fortunately seen a decline in terrorism since then. So Algeria, what I point to, which I find interesting, is this group Jund al-Khalifa. They were a break-off from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. They're part of what's called the center zone for that organization. They made a splash by putting a video out, kidnapping a French hiker and beheading him. The interesting thing about them is it's very little known, but basically the Algerian government managed to basically completely eliminate this group in the months that followed. One of the lesser known instances in which we've seen an entire militant organization just get defeated. In this case, it seems that what they did was lure them to a farm, surrounded it, and basically mercilessly slaughtered members of this organization, then continued to hunt them down. But one can see very clearly after that initial clampdown that you haven't seen ISIS activity in Algeria. That this was the one splash that they made, after which the organization was basically kaput. Turning to Morocco, the interesting thing I would point out about Morocco is this is a photo of the 2003 Casablanca bombing, which has very much influenced the way that they understand the dangers that militant movements could pose to the country. You've had a fairly high number of Moroccans go over to Syria as foreign fighters. About 1,500 have gone over. And the state has a mix of soft policies and harder counterterrorism policies. The soft policies include attempts at, if not political reform, at least bringing some of the opposition closer into the system, but and also some policies that relate to the teaching of religion in mosques. On the hard side, they have basically a zero tolerance approach to foreign fighters, which creates this very interesting contradiction in Moroccan policy, where on the one hand, they've been, at least early on, strong backers of the Syrian uprising, right? They even hosted a conference in December 2012 in Marrakesh, a Friends of Syria conference. But then on the other hand, for Moroccans who go over to Syria to support the uprising, they're basically summarily arrested once they return to the country. That to me is interesting. The final point, the final country is Mauritania, where you had, there's a lot to be said about Mauritania. I know there will be a panel on it later on, and I'm sure that they'll get into some of the socio-economic and political issues in the country. But what you've had in Mauritania is a marked decline in terrorist attacks. In June 2005, there was an attack on an army base in Mauritania that killed 17 people. Between 2007 and 2011, you had multiple attacks striking the capital. And since then, there's been a serious decline. Now, reviewing the literature on this, most scholarship tends to credit President Aziz's multi-pronged approach to combating the spread of extremism, including theological house cleaning efforts, state de-radicalization programs, and also its hard counterterrorism strategy. I would propose something else may be going on, and we don't know this for sure, but let me point to a few documents. In the bin Laden files that were taken from Abbottabad, you have a few things going on in unearthed letters. One is Al-Qaeda strategists contemplated a truce with Mauritania, if Mauritania would pay them. Secondly, they went through the Sharia permissibility and found that under their interpretation it would be acceptable to enter a truce. Then you had senior leadership of Al-Qaeda even draft a sample truce, which would be implemented in exchange for Mauritania paying 10 to 20 million euros annually. Then you have this figure, Abu Hafs al-Maritani, a former Al-Qaeda official, who spoke in media interviews about his satisfaction with the attitude of the Mauritanian authorities in what he called their policy of non-aggression. It raises an interesting possibility, which I don't think we can answer definitively right now, but I would simply raise the question of whether Mauritania is actually paying a militant group to avoid attacks in its country, which there's multiple documents that are strongly suggestive. And ultimately, we'll know the answer maybe in 5 years, but I find that to be an interesting aspect. So, in conclusion, you've seen different trends in terms of militancy, and I think part of what it fleshes out is different ways that these militant movements work. If there's one area in which I would say militant movements tend to be understood, it's that their capacity for strategic thought is often underestimated, which in turn, I think, leads to analytic misjudgments about what they are likely to do. Thank you.